To the 2022 New South Wales Linear Reserve Environmental Management Forum. My name's Neil Dufty. I'm the Executive Officer of the New South Wales Roadside Environment Committee, and I'll be your MC during this forum. Now, the speakers are per the forum program. Obviously, with the new normal of COVID, we've had a few issues around that, but in most cases, we've had an alternate, so the forum program will be pretty close to as it is. And that's actually the forum. You can use your smartphone and use the QR code to access the program during the day. There were a few printed copies, but because we're an environmental management forum, we didn't want to print out too many copies just to save some paper. So you could use that QR code to access the program during the day. And that program, as I said, is pretty much as it is there. It's a very tight program, and you can see that there isn't a lot of opportunities for questions, but we will be having a panel session at the end, and there will be plenty of opportunities there to interact. And obviously, a main part of today is around networking, so we really encourage you to talk to each other and during the lunch and morning tea breaks and afternoon tea, and hopefully we can get to know each other and learn from each other. In terms of just one other little bit of introduction. You also can ask questions for the panel and also presenters using the Slido the code there, QR code. And there's the hashtag for the forum if you wish to tweet or go on Instagram or whatever. I won't say TikTok. In terms of housekeeping, morning tea's at 10:30, lunch at 12:30, afternoon tea at 2:15. Toilet facilities, you've probably already seen are outside. In terms of emergency evacuation, use the main entrance that you came in. In terms of COVID protocol, you can already see that this venue is very well set up in terms of COVID protocol. There are hand sanitisers around. If you wish to wear a mask, we honour that and respect it. Also, we can socially distance here in this wonderful theatrette. And also, you can, we encourage you not necessarily to handshake. If you want to do that, that's fine. But, the old other type, or, just say hi. So just keep in mind that COVID protocol during the time. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Uncle Alan Madden from the Sydney Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council to give the welcome to country.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Elder. I'm here today to put a bit of colour in your day. For my first song, nah. Only kidding. Married man, not kidding. 10 children, 26 grandchildren, and 17 great-great. Yes, we did have TV. Just couldn't afford the bloody electricity. Born and bred in Redfern, the capital of Sydney. A long time ago. As we've all welcomed the countries, it's always an honour and a pleasure for me to welcome one and all the country. Just to give you a bit of an insight of where you are and who we are. As we've all welcomed the countries, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations and traditional owners of the lands that you may have come from, and pay my respects to all our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present, also pay my respects. To all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or island nation you may have come from, welcome to Gadigal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state, or across town, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. And as I've mentioned many times before, was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Only three things surer than that: coming, taxation and going. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here today to welcome one and all to Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own, the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Peene to the west, and Georges River to the south. And in between those three mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation, there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on today is Gadigal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. There's an old Aboriginal saying out there, I think it's very appropriate for you mob here today. They say, where there's a will, there's relatives. So once again, on behalf of the Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that welcome to country. Appreciate it. Thank you. Next on our agenda is also a welcome from the Chair of the New South Wales Roadside Environment Committee, Mr. Martin Driver.
Thank you, Neil, and yes, welcome all, and thank you very much, Uncle Alan. That was great. And yes, we must always recognise and acknowledge the management of the lands and of the traditional owners of all the lands that we all come from today, and that's really what we're talking about, is the ongoing management of these landscapes and these amazing areas. This is probably, as Neil said, probably the first time that most of you have got together for a conference and a get-together like this with COVID the last few years. I hope we all can enjoy and feel comfortable and get the most out of the day. It's a great opportunity, and it's a great opportunity to come together. The picture up on the screen really highlights the fact that this is sort of the majority view of the world, of people travelling the Australian and the New South Wales landscapes. This is probably the closest that most people get to viewing nature of any sort, is the bit that they see on the sides of the road. Today we'll be looking at some of the issues of management and some of the best practices and some of the opportunities that various speakers and groups have taken up. Neil will be talking more about the background and history a little bit of the New South Wales Roadside Environment Committee. We're coming up for our 30th year. I think the significance is getting more and more important, and the ongoing management of these areas, and if not best practice, even starting with good practice is a good thing. But I just hope that we can all just enjoy today, engage, ask questions, let's talk, let's network, because that's really what the REC is all about. And I'll hand back to Neil. I hope everyone enjoys the day and hope to catch up with as many people as possible. Thank you.
Right, just as Martin said, I'll just give you a little bit of context for a couple of minutes about linear reserves in New South Wales and also the role of the Roadside Environment Committee. So when we talk about linear reserves, obviously these are long, straight, in some cases mostly straight parcels of land which crisscross the state. They include roadsides, travelling stock reserves, public utility corridors like electricity easements, rail corridors, but also a lot of Crown reserves. And in those Crown reserves, there's what we call paper roads, which are roads that were going to be roads, but didn't turn out to be roads, and they're still in the environment. In some cases, they've been sold off to landholders, but in many cases, they are there as well. So if you add all that extent of linear reserve up, you come to about 6% of the land area of the state. But obviously these linear reserves have great values, and we're going to learn a lot more about these during the day together. Obviously, most of you are involved in some form of land management, so you would appreciate these different values. But it's important to say that this is a significant part of the state. When you fly across the state and you look down, you can see that, wow, these linear reserves go all over the place. So they're highly critical, obviously highly critical in terms of the environments. We'll learn more about that, as I said, as the forum goes on. Just in terms of the Roadside Environment Committee, who is it and what does the Roadside Environment Committee do? Well, firstly, the Roadside Environment Committee is a state government committee, and it started in 1994, and they are the organisations that make up the committee. So it's not just the road managers, which are essentially Transport for New South Wales and local councils, but it also consists of those that manage the rail corridors around the state, also some of the utility easement managers, also the Nature Conservation Council representing environment groups, and also the Department of Planning and Environment, Crown Lands, etc., and of course local government New South Wales, and also IPWA representing the works managers across the state as well. In terms of what does it do, essentially it does what this is about: networking, promoting good practice, as Martin was saying, and also providing education and sharing across these land managers. How the Roadside Environment Committee can help: there's quite a few services. For example, it provides signage for important roadside areas. For example, they might have threatened species and also endangered environmental communities. We provide a newsletter. If you haven't received that, please just Google us, and you'll Google my name and I'll add you to the mailing list. There's there's 400 or 500 people that receive that newsletter, and basically it's propped up by really great articles about what people are doing around the state in linear reserve environments. Obviously give advice, provide guides, and you'll hear a little bit about this during the day as well. And I must really plug the New South Wales Environmental or Excellence in the Environment Awards. This is run by Local Government New South Wales. There is a Roadside Environmental Award open for councils, and we really encourage councils to submit an entry to these awards. The awards are open on the 6th of June. The entries close 27th of July. It's the Roadside Environment Committee that sponsors this award, and it's been running since 2011. The first winner was Mid-Western Regional Council, and last year it was Penrith City Council. So we really encourage any of the councils here to submit an application for that award, and the award is actually announced in December. So without further ado, that's it for me. Just a little bit of context about the Roadside Environment Committee and what it does, and also about linear reserves, but I'm sure we'll all learn a lot more as the forum goes on. So we've got our first keynote speaker. We've got two keynote speakers, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Rodney van der Ree presenting. Now, Dr. van der Ree is a National Technical Executive in Ecology at WSP Australia and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Melbourne. He has international recognition for his expertise in urban ecology and transportation ecology and has worked across Australia and internationally. He published the International Award-winning Handbook of Road Ecology, has sat on expert advisory committees for international transport agencies, and has over 80 refereed scientific publications on this topic. We're very fortunate to have Rod here. Rod, over to you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a real privilege. It's great to actually see people that are like round rather than just flat faces on screen. So that's pretty exciting, I must say. My presentation today is basically, I want to give you a bit of a, like within 20 minutes, a snapshot of the history of sort of road ecology, where we've come from in Australia and internationally, and then where I think we need to go next, and all that in 20 minutes, so hang on. Here we go. So road ecology started about 100 years ago. The first published paper that we know of, 1925, Mr. Stoner drove across the US and on his way stopped and recorded the roadkill that he saw. The numbers were quite high. I don't know what his wife thought, but anyway. Since then, numerous books have been published. We've had special issues in journals. We've had thousands of published papers and reports, and I'm guessing gazillions of dollars have been spent on various avoidance, minimisation, mitigation techniques. And so, as I said, what I'm hoping to do today is summarise where we've come from, how far we've gone, and where to go next. First of all, pointing out that there are a few sort of major, what I would call global standouts in mitigation. So this is from the Netherlands. It's a 700-metre long overpass. Being the Netherlands, of course, it crosses canals. There's a railway that it passes over and a multi-lane highway as well. There's also a few sort of whoopsies that we've made. This is on your right. It's a dry culvert for wildlife, and on the left, 3 round pipes for drainage. I won't tell you where that's from. It's not New South Wales, so you're lucky. In Australia, at least, the conservation value of roadsides was probably one of the first things that we acknowledged. And Edna Walling, who was a landscape architect, she published the Australian Roadside in 1952. Since then, there's been a bit of research in the 80s and 90s looking at the conservation value of roadsides by numerous people at CSIRO and Andrew Bennett in Victoria and others. The roadside environment committees were formed, as was mentioned, the New South Wales REC established in 1994. And we now know that these linear strips of habitat along roads, along roadsides, railways and unused road reserves are really important habitat for a whole range of species, including many rare and endangered ones. And they're also really important as these corridors for movement across otherwise fragmented and cleared landscapes. In the 60s and 70s, there was a bit of a focus on motorist safety in the US and Western Europe, particularly because collisions with deer often ends in fatalities, much more significant, at much higher rates than collisions with kangaroos in Australia. So it's worth pointing out that as the number of deer and the distribution of deer in Australia spreads, we will start to see more of those collisions and outcomes happening. The first crossings for wildlife was built either in France or Switzerland. There's a bit of conjecture and a bit of, not quite fisticuffs, but a bit of discussion about who built the first one. And in Australia, some anecdotal kind of, one-off surveys of roadkill, but generally not too much interest at this point in Australia on roadkill. Internationally, though, there were some questions being raised about what are the impacts of roads and traffic on wildlife, and I guess it's really becoming a nascent study, field of study and work during the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, it picked up a little bit, so we continued studying roadside vegetation and understanding their importance and their dynamics. The first crossings for wildlife was for the tunnel of what we call the Tunnel of Love, which was for mountain pygmy possums in the Victorian Alps. So upslope of this particular road, the females would live, the males would come up, mate with the females, and without a road there, they would come back down to the lower slopes, leaving the females access to enough food to fatten up so they could survive the winter. With the road in place, the males and the juveniles did not disperse back down slope, so that led to greater competition for food, lower body weights and lower survival. So this was built in 86. It's still one of the only examples in the world where we've demonstrated a population level effect of mitigation. So we can see that the population has increased in size and is more viable now than what it was prior to being built. One of the few examples in the world still. We've had a few targeted studies of roadkill in Australia. Human safety is still a major focus in Australia and around the world, but it's beginning to shift to a conservation lens as well. But it still is not mainstream on Australian roads to think about wildlife and think about conservation as we're planning and designing new roads. In the 90s, mid-90s, we saw the first wildlife underpass in New South Wales. This was for spotted tail quolls on the Pacific Highway, and that's a photo of that there. The term road ecology was coined, so we started actually calling this, this thing that we all do, a proper name, and it was road ecology. Conferences were held on this topic in Europe and the US, and the focus is now becoming human safety, still a major driver, but it's also about conservation of wildlife. In Australia, we had the Threatened Species Act for New South Wales and the EPBC Act nationally. They came into place, and what that meant was that where there are threatened or endangered species that are being potentially impacted by projects, that we had to start considering those in the planning and design. And so to sum up the last 22 years, we've seen a massive explosion of research and practice globally and also in Australia. We've had lots of guidelines published like these from RMS or Transport for New South Wales. We've had a number of conferences here in Australia. We call that ANET, which is the Australasian Network for Ecology and Transportation. We had the first one in Brisbane in 2009, Coffs Harbour in 2014, and we had one in Victoria in 2018. And next year, if everything goes to plan, we'll be holding one of those in New Zealand. So you're all invited to that. We had some major research collaborations in the past 10 to 15 years, lots of universities involved, lots of transportation departments. And although we said we weren't going to use TikTok, if the Pacific Highway was a place or a person, they could be an influencer on TikTok, because that highway has been a significant influence on this whole business in the last 20 odd years, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. There's also been a lot of work on a whole bunch of other major roads, the Hume Freeway, the Princess Highway, lots and lots of those around Australia. So some of the books that have been published, and this is one that's actually coming out the 15th, maybe yesterday, I've lost track of dates. So this Clouded Leopard in the Middle of the Road is I guess it's written by Daryl Jones. It's a global perspective, but it's really written for non-specialists. So if you want to buy a present for your mum or dad, or I don't know, your grandmother or whatever, this would be great for them. It's a bit of a coffee table book, lots of information, really accessible, and it sort of highlights that. And there is a 30% off discount there if you want to quickly get a photo of that. We started this website last year. It's also designed to basically translate scientific information into really simple, easy to understand language. So there's three parts to it. There's research summaries, peer-reviewed research that we get them to rewrite into a blog-style format. Case studies are coming online in the next few weeks, and best practice will be the next bit that follows. But if you go to the website transportecology.info, hit the subscribe button, you'll get updates of when we publish things. So that's a really, and it's free to access. So rather than having to pay ridiculous amounts of money for paywalled journals, you can access the same information summarised on here. So the TikTok influencer bit, Pacific Highway, just over 20 years worth of work, a huge amount of money, lots of projects, lots of jobs, etc., etc. Many of you probably know a bit about this already. But in terms of its influence on road ecology, it's really hard to, I guess, summarise that in a real short way, except to say almost 500 kilometres of fauna fencing, almost 300 wildlife crossing structures, countless monitoring programs. If there's any project, potentially even I haven't thought about this until now, but potentially internationally as well, with its length and the number of projects, number of crossing structures, I can't think of anything that even comes close to this. But don't hold me to that. I'll maybe do some fact checking like a good person should do in an election campaign. Some of the crossing structures, we've got bridges where we've retained vegetation underneath. There's rope bridges, there's glider poles, there's koala things through culverts, widened medians, land bridges, escape ramps that were being experimented with, a whole range of different things on that project that have now been rolled out around the world. But what's next? That's where we've been, but what are the things that we're still not doing as well as we could or as well as we should? And that's what I want to cover now. So, climate change. Are we designing the infrastructure we build, whether it's roads, railways, power lines, whatever it might be, are we designing them for the future climatic conditions? What's the impact of extreme weather events on this infrastructure? And we've seen floods. I don't need to talk to people from New South Wales and southeast Queensland about floods. You guys know probably better than most how these extreme weather events impact your lives and your infrastructure. From a road ecology perspective, will these dry underpasses that we're designing now for terrestrial animals that like to keep their feet dry, will they be inundated more often than they should be or permanently in 20 years' time? If we're replacing wetlands adjacent to highways for amphibians, will they function in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time the way we want them to function? We've got vegetation along roadsides. If these die, perhaps there's a fire, flood, drought, whatever it might be, and they die or they start to change, will they grow back? Is something different? And is that something different okay, or is it something that we want to try and protect? Are the crossing structures we build for wildlife, are they in the places where the future habitat for that species is going to be in 50 years' time? If the vegetation changes, maybe the crossing's not here anymore, maybe it's 100 metres up the slope or 500 metres away or a kilometre away. And perhaps most importantly and most concerningly, are the crossings that we design today adequate enough to enable species and communities and ecosystems to shift their ranges in the future? Because the species where they live today is not going to be as suitable in 50 or 100 years' time as it is today. So can these species, communities and ecosystems shift, or will they be stuck on one side of the road and as they watch their habitat disappearing? Population level considerations. Very rarely does one single event result in the extinction of a species. In this example here, the road is built at the edge of that grey box, and there's various impacts that happen that over time incrementally result in a reduction in the size of a population. So first it's habitat loss, then there's a reduction in habitat quality, there's some mortality that occurs, there's reduced connectivity, and each time these things decrease the size of a population. And it gets to such a point, such a low level of population size, that they're at a very high risk of extinction. And then it might just be some random event that ultimately causes the extinction. And the question is, are we considering this population level effects adequately when we're planning, designing and assessing the effectiveness of mitigation? A recent study came out last year. They looked at over 1,500 peer-reviewed publications and they were asking the question, and it's not worded very well, but do transportation networks imperil wildlife populations? Do they increase the risk of extinction? They only found 8% of these 1,500 odd studies actually looked at population level. Only 2% of those studies actually looked at species that were listed by the IUCN as threatened by roads. And even though we know that roads and railways generally, not always, but generally have a negative impact on wildlife, they concluded from this study that we are far from understanding how roads, or to what extent roads, affect the long-term viability of populations. So we've still got a long way to go. I think this is one of the most important things, because we do not want to be spending money on mitigation if it doesn't actually do enough. Maybe we need to be spending more. Maybe we need to be doing it differently. There's some of the things that we need to tackle. Any 15-year-olds in the audience? Because I'm about to offer you a job. In Australia, we still do not have a fully functioning, nationally relevant or applicable roadkill collection app. I wouldn't say most other countries, many other countries have them. We've had a few in different states that have been working to some degree, but ideally we would have an app that works across the entire country. It's useful for citizen scientists, it's useful for the wildlife carers who are assessing animals on the side of the road. The transportation agencies can use them for targeted, monitoring programs. Clean-up crews, picking up dead animals from the side of the road. It's usually just classified as litter or animal carcass. Well, that's, to be frank, bloody useless. How are we supposed to know if it's a kangaroo or a dog or a cow? What are we need this information so we can plan where mitigation needs to be built. And if you're a 15-year-old, you can probably develop this in a couple of weeks. Old people can do it too, don't get me wrong, but they're probably good at it. And that roadkill information is really important, because the question needs to be asked, are we mitigating impacts at the most important locations on our road network? And this applies across the country and, indeed internationally. We've got 185,000 kilometres of roads in the state. I've just made up a few hundred kilometres maybe of major roads being built each year, probably not even that much. And of course, and as we should be doing, most of the mitigation we build is on those new roads, because that's the most cost-effective place to do it. We've got all the machinery there, it's the right time, it makes sense to do it. But is it the most ecologically effective if there's already 185,000 other kilometres of roads where these impacts are also occurring? So my suggestion is that we need to target retrofits to mitigate impacts on the existing infrastructure as well as the existing network. I'll talk about a project in the Netherlands as well in a moment, but in the US in the last few months, the federal government, one of Biden's first things that he did was he brought out the infrastructure bill, which is where heaps of money, I forget the exact amount, is being committed to this sort of retrofit program across the US, and the states can apply for these funds. 2 minutes, moving along. Although you didn't flash me this, so I don't know if I heard you. The Dutch defragmentation program, it's a 14-year program. They overlaid the roads, the railways and the canals. They identified 178 places, put in 550 measures, spent 440 million euros, and they've got this strategic prioritised approach to mitigating on their existing network. They've got 80 land bridges, plus heaps of other things, heaps of other crossing structures in an area 1/20th the size of New South Wales. The other area I think we can do some better work on is ecological connectivity analysis. So this is basically an objective approach when you're planning roads to think about the impacts of that project on connectivity for biodiversity. You can compare different alignments, you can identify where the current connectivity is for wildlife. You can then rank assess the effectiveness of different mitigation for that. But the beauty of this is it's objective. It's not about who's got the loudest voice in a room when you're doing a plan. The road effect zone extends up to thousands of metres from the road itself. It's a consequence of noise, light, mortality, microclimate, weeds, etc. And it's influenced by a whole range of things like vegetation, topography, the type of road, the traffic volume, the species. And what it basically means is that there's this zone of influence next to the roads where species either can't exist or the habitat's not as good a quality. And what that means from a planning perspective is generally we just think about the actual surface of the road. But potentially we might be talking about 100 metres of habitat or more where species are not impacted. So there's a direct loss of habitat from the road itself, but there's also indirect habitat loss that we should also be thinking about in our planning processes. I could talk for an hour about this one, but we need more rigorous science and evidence-based decision making. We need to continue to support good research. I'm not talking just about monitoring of particular projects, but we need to identify strategic research needs and then collaborate and pool resources across jurisdictions. It seems silly to me that in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, we're all putting cameras on rope bridges when, the same possums species are using them in all three areas. We could be saving money, we could be targeting that funds towards a specific research question and answering that well. We need good trials. I think there's a real risk to adopt certain techniques that are appealing. There's roadside acoustic deterrents that are being sort of pushed. There's very little evidence that they actually work. We need to think about the goals for mitigation. Reducing roadkill, increasing connectivity are not specific enough. We need a bit more specific detail in those objectives when we're thinking about mitigation. And then we can actually target the monitoring. Compliance monitoring will only get us so far. When the regulator says, put another camera on a rope bridge, I think we should be pushing back and saying, why? We've now got 50 studies that show that possums use rope bridges. We don't need another one. What exactly are we trying to answer with this monitoring? Just quickly, different countries in Europe, they get together and they put their money together and they decide what their research questions are for this is a 3-year period, and then they issue a request for proposals and people get together and they do this research. But it's collaborative, it's across countries. Surely we can do it across states, maybe. So the take-home messages, the questions and the challenges. In summary of what I've been talking about today, New South Wales have been and they remain leaders in this sort of road ecology, transport ecology space. And so I thank Transport and RMS before them for their involvement. We know a lot, we understand a lot, we know how to do a lot. There's still a lot we can do and need to do. So where to next? This population level understanding. Are we doing enough to prevent population declines and ideally reversing a decline into a gain? Is climate change adequately being considered and assessed in our planning and designs? I think we need to continue to push to move away from compliance monitoring and think about strategic research. I'm not saying monitoring is not worth doing, and there may be reasons to put another camera on a rope bridge, but let's be really clear about what it is we're trying to understand. And that's around the effectiveness in relation to specific objectives. I think we need to collaborate more across jurisdictions in a whole range of ways. And that road effect zone, I think we're beginning to understand that a lot better. We've got some numbers and sizes and severity of road effect zones in Australia for Australian conditions and species, and we need to start using that in planning and also the connectivity modelling. And I also think landscape scale defragmentation is a very important and underappreciated thing. So thank you very much. If we have time for questions, or not.
We'll pick up the questions in your panel. No, that was wonderful. No worries. Well, thanks a lot, Rod. Now, in terms of questions, and that was a wonderful presentation. Rod will be around during the day, and also he will be on the panel this afternoon. So if you want to use your Slido, questions, we can pick those questions up during the time. There's the Slido QR code, so we can pick that up. So no, I really appreciate that. That was a wonderful presentation and really set the scene for the forum. Our other keynote speaker is Professor David Eldridge, and we're very fortunate to have Professor Eldridge here today. He is a Senior Principal Research Science with the Department of Planning Environment and Professor at the University of New South Wales. He has 4 decades of experience in rangeland management and assessment and the ecology of dryland ecosystems. He is an editor of the Journal of Arid Environments and Restoration Ecology and has published over 250 papers on plants, soils, microbes and ecosystem health. Over the past decade, David's research has focused on the effects of livestock grazing on plants and soils, woody plant encroachment and the effects of rewilding native animals on plants and soils and the ecology and management of biological soil crust. And David will be presenting on roadside support, healthy vegetation and soils. Please welcome Dr. David Eldridge.
Thanks, Neil. And that was a great presentation, Rodney. You really set the scene and took most of my material. I feel like a bit of a fraud here, really, because I don't really work on roadsides. I'm interested in how plants and animals interact. And about 20 years ago, this is old research I'm going to report now, but we've only just published it because I have a very keen PhD student, Jingyi Ding from China, and she was going through my filing cabinet. She goes, "You haven't published this work." So Jingyi kind of pulled it all together, and we just published it last couple of months ago in Journal of Environmental Management. So what I wanted to do today is to talk about this study we did in New South Wales, but to give you a little bit of background, and some of it you've already heard from Rodney. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I found this map of the extent of linear reserves. Well, these are really road reserves, not counting our rail reserves and power line easements. But you can see, whoa, why does it keep... But you can see that there's a fairly extensive array of reserves going in a north-south direction. There's also some large ones out in the Western Division, which I'm more familiar with, just south of Broken Hill. Is there a pointer here, Neil? Yeah, I don't want to press the wrong button and turn all the lights off.
That's forward and
Yeah,
that's back. Yeah.
that's it. Okay, no pointer. That's all right. So fairly extensive system. And as Rodney said, how bizarre. It's really sensitive. Maybe it's sensitive to my voice. These road reserves provide habitat for plants and animals, and often they're threatened species, which is really amazing. We've heard all about their importance for connectivity, not just for organisms, but also for their genetic material. And I guess as conservationists, we often forget about livestock. And really, these are critical places for livestock grazing. In the huge droughts in the 82 and other droughts later on, these long paddocks were critically important for sustaining pastoralists through the drought. And, there's an argument that a bit of high-intensity grazing for short duration is actually good for the vegetation. There are also places of solitude. Some of you might know this character. He used to work for Greening Australia, John Namo. He's now retired, so he has a lot of time to come out with me and take photos of, oh man, what's going on? He has a lot of time to come out and take photos of bugs. So these are pretty important areas for people to get together, and also for stuff like beekeeping. They're really critically important. And as we've heard from Rodney, the previous speaker, some of these linear reserves range from really crappy road reserves. This was 2 metres wide, about 5 metres wide around Cootamundra, to quite large reserves down in the Western Riverina, a large diversity of plants, fantastic perennial grasses. Here's another one west of Hay, which is fantastic habitat for small ground-dwelling birds. Bit closer in near West Wyalong, and this one, which I was amazed at, I stopped for breakfast here just south of West Wyalong, and this is an old borrow pit on a travelling stock reserve. It's obviously vegetated, and I was doing a bit of birding, and I saw about 6 species of water birds there. But there's lots of problems with these reserves. I don't know what it is. Maybe Martin can tell us. But landholders just feel the need to mow outside their front fence. Or even worse, clean it up. West Wyalong, very depressing. Whoops. Oh, man. Don't flog the log. You've probably heard that, a great slogan from Victoria to stop people cutting firewood from road reserves, because we know they're critical habitat for foraging of things like brown tree creepers, also for reptiles and invertebrates, so critically important. Actually, I had a lot of trouble trying to find a photo of people cutting in the last 3 months since Neil invited me to give this presentation. A lot of trouble trying to find evidence that people had been cutting firewood. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe the message is getting through. And of course, overgrazing, although this is sustainable grazing. So what do we know about roadsides? There's been a few surveys, regional surveys, particularly down the southern part and the central west, Olympic Highway. I went to a meeting of a council that will remain nameless in southern New South Wales once, and one of the councillors got up and said, "We've got to cut down all those yellow box, they're causing car accidents." So, I mean, that's the sort of thing we're dealing with some councils. I guess they're a lot more enlightened these days. Okay, so what did we find? I had 2 very keen students who did a transect from Howlong in southern New South Wales right up to Coolah. They stopped every 6 kilometres and they looked at the condition of the roadside. Now, lots of this sort of stuff's been done before. People have looked at roadside reserves, but what we wanted to do was to compare how the roadside was performing compared with the adjacent land use. And sometimes that was cropping, sometimes it was grazing, sometimes it was forest, so a whole bunch of different land uses. So we had large plots, 400 square metres, about 20 metres by 20 metres. Obviously, in some cases, you couldn't get 20 metres along a roadside, so it had to be longer than wider. And they did about 111 sites. Interestingly, working at a university, we wouldn't be able to do this study anymore because of the work health and safety issues. They'd probably have to wear hard hats. We'd probably have to have beacons out either side. It'd be very difficult. What did they measure? Well, they measured all of these things. Overstory, tree cover, plant cover, number of trees with hollows, logs and coarse woody debris, the cover of biological crusts, mosses, lichens, liverworts, erosion, recruitment, demography, everything they could think of. And most of these things were measured in categories, and I'm not going to go into this. If you want a copy of the paper, just come and see me later, and I'll send it to you. But there are particular methods that we can use that are kind of quick and dirty. How did we assess the difference between the paddocks and the roadside? Well, what we did is we got the value for what, let's say, number of plant species on the road, subtracted from that the number of plant species in the adjoining paddock and divided by the sum. And what that does is it scales all these different units, all these different variables into a common scale from -1 to +1. And in our case, if the value was positive, the roadside's better, it has a greater value for that attribute, and conversely, if it's negative, it has a lower value. So what do we find? Well, all those blue dots there, all those blue dots there are better or greater in the roadside. Ground story carbon, ground story cover, tree carbon, tree density, shrub, it goes on and on and on and on. Pretty much everything except for erosion and the degree of modification were greater in the roadsides. There were three things that didn't vary across those two extremes across the fence, and that was percentage of native plants, soil bulk density, and organic carbon pools. So basically, things are better along the road. I know carbon is very topical and people tend to, flog it a bit these days. Everyone wants to get money for carbon. But if you look at those two bars on the far right, the orangey coloured bar and the bluish kind of bar, we can see that if you tally up the amount of carbon in the trees, the grass, the shrubs and the soil, we've got something like 3 times more carbon along the roadsides than we have in the adjoining paddock. And this is not just for a couple of sites. This is for a fairly extensive transect through half of New South Wales at 111 sites. More carbon on the roadsides. We also found that roadsides were good for regeneration. Just consider those two bars, actually along the x-axis, along the bottom, we have the 5 different size classes of trees, from seedlings to saplings, juveniles, large trees and mature trees. Not a lot of difference in the density of mature trees and large trees, or even juveniles between the paddock and the roadside. But if you look at seedlings and saplings on the left, we can see that there are many, many more saplings and more seedlings on the road than there are in the paddock. And what does that mean? That means that if there's going to be regeneration, and we know that a lot of these mature trees are the living dead, they're going to be gone in 200 years, where are the seedlings going to come from? They're going to come from the road. They're not going to come from the paddock. Oh, it's not working now. I'm jinxed. Okay, and it doesn't matter whether we look at all trees or whether we look at individual species. Bottom left-hand corner, yellow box. Many more seedlings along the road. That's that class 1. Same thing with ironbark, bottom right. Top left, can't remember what's the common name for Angophila floribunda, is it? Thank you, rough-barked apple. Many more seedlings. And the same goes for most of those species. Dwyer's mallygum, grey box, white box, Blakely's red gum. Pretty amazing. All those species are doing better on the road than the paddock. I think, Rodney, you might have mentioned something about I can't remember what it is, that zone of influence out from the road. That suggests to us that big roadside verges are better than narrow ones. So we tested that. And along the bottom there we have the width of the reserve. It's on a log scale because some of them are quite large. And all those different attributes. Now if that line is going up from bottom left to top right, that means that things are getting better as the roadside gets wider. More coarse woody debris, more native species, more biocrust cover, more tree diversity. That goes on and on and on. Things are getting better as the roadside reserve width increases. I just want to finish with this sort of model of how we used a modelling process called structural equation modelling, which is kind of how the players all fit together. And I just want to show you this example, which is a piece of that model. On the right-hand side, we have management. And what we found was that our measure of management was not good for roadsides. So timber cutting, removal of coarse woody debris, motor vehicle activity, overgrazing, what that does is it reduces soil carbon. That arrow, minus 0.35, and the fact that it's red is saying that's bad. Management reduces soil carbon. We know that management also reduces tree diversity, and that value is quite large. The bigger the value, the bigger the effect. But the really interesting thing is that using this modelling technique and working at these sites, we now know that part of the reason for management having a negative effect on soil carbon is that it reduces the positive effect of tree diversity on soil carbon. Tree diversity enhances soil carbon, so if management reduces tree diversity, then soil carbon is going to go down. So, just trying to pull it all together, I guess what we can say is that roadside verges are more functional than adjacent agricultural land. Interestingly, when Neil rang me up and asked me to talk, I said, look, I'm on long service leave. They won't let me say anything. This will be political. He goes, oh, no, it's okay, I'll talk to them. Anyway, so my manager read the paper. She goes, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? So maybe it's all obvious. Wasn't obvious to me. Roadside verges are more functional. We know that wider reserves are better than narrow reserves. These sites are going to be refuges for tree regeneration. I think that's probably one of the most important things that's come out of this, that all the regeneration is along the roadside. Disturbance is bad. And without getting political, I think one of the things that just gets me is the fact that a lot of these roadside reserves have sort of become de facto paddocks. They sort of become part of the adjoining landholder's land. You know, they put new fences up. I know you used to be a pastoralist, Martin, you probably have a different view. You're a good manager, but a lot of them aren't well managed. And these are state assets, and we should look after them. And that's all I'm going to say. Thank you. Oh, I didn't know.
Thanks a lot, David. We have got some time for questions.
Rodney up as well?
No, he's going to be on the panel at the end, so we really want to ask you some questions. By the way, this is being recorded. It's not live streamed, but if you have a question, if you can walk over or you can get somebody else to move over and ask the question via the microphone, that's the only way we can really record your question. And also I'm just telling you that we are recording from a privacy point of view as well, so that you're aware of that. We have got 2 or 3 minutes for some questions. By the way, we're going to extend the morning tea break for half an hour, so you can come and talk to Rod and David. Also, you know, the aim of this is networking. I was down to kind of speak, but I was only a filler, and all of what I'm going to say has been better covered by our keynote speaker, so you don't need me. I'll drop off that program quite gladly. So I just wondered if there were any questions to David in particular. If you had one for Rod, that's fine, but he will be on the panel later on. And I think we've got one right now. Over to you, David.
Okay, sure.
I'm not sure if it's on.
Should be.
Yep, it's on.
Jessica Bollinger from ARTC. I was just interested in the findings that even though the ground cover and all of the vegetation above the ground was greater in the roadside corridors, erosion seemed to perform, it performed better from an erosion perspective. Can you give us a comment on that, please?
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what there was less. There was more erosion in the adjoining paddock than there was. Did you get that?
No, sorry, I took it the other way. That
Oh, okay. No, erosion was much substantially lower. Erosion is a winner in the paddock or a loser in the.
Presented as a positive. That's the one. It's an inverse.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I misread the.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, erosion was definitely lower. On the roadsides.
Right.
Fantastic. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Just a question, David. One of the things you mentioned in terms of management, the types of management that you outlined were negative
Yeah.
management. I think the thing is that there are some positive, and that's really the key to everything I think we're talking about is that we need to move from sort of passive management, bad management or no management to some sort of active management and resourcing that and valuing these assets.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, perhaps I've used the wrong word. Maybe disturbance is a better word. All of those activities I was talking about are really what you would call ecologically negative disturbances. They're, rubbish dumping, motorcycle riding, cutting of firewood. They're all kind of negative things. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, I mean, is probably short-term intensive grazing is probably a good thing in a lot of these reserves. Reduces fire risk. Enhances the vitality of the vegetation sometimes.
Yeah, I think doing nothing is not management. Is
I agree.
My point.
Yeah, I agree.
Just one other comment, which again is bleedingly obvious, I think, but is often neglected. The notion that on roadsides we get more tree regeneration, it's because we've got those seed sources there, and it's not just for trees. It is the shrubs, it is the ground layer as well, and from work that and my background has been, the only source for getting plants of many species is roadsides. And that's, it's an obvious notion, but I think it's often neglected. We talk about the regeneration on the roadsides. If we're looking at broad-scale restoration works, those sources of seed from roadsides and other seed production is going to be critical in the future when we talk about carbon and land management and all these other benefits of roads.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely.
Right, we've got time for one more question. Anybody else would like to ask a question? I think that might be it. Well, I'd like to thank Dr. David Eldridge. Thanks very much. Thank you. Sorry also for the AV problem, but I don't know what happened there. We're going to have morning tea now, and we will have that till 11 o'clock, and then we'll have our next set of presenters. So we should have our morning tea out there at the moment, and we'll give you a bit of a coming time at around about 2 minutes before 11. Thanks very much.